All right, welcome back, everybody. It's great to see you here with us today. We are so excited to welcome some new guests. In this particular episode, we're going to talk about continued considerations and practices that make grading for learning possible. So I've mentioned about the blog post, 3 ways to make the switch to grading for learning. Inside that, we discuss the importance of making sure to attend to students' growth in both academics and behaviors. But it's important that we report on those kinds of learning separately. So I want to welcome first and foremost our guest, Matt Townsley. Matt is a well-known leader in the field of grading and assessment practices. He previously served as a high school math teacher, where he had some major mind shifts in grading practices, which I've read about. Later a district administrator in Iowa, and he's currently an assistant professor of educational leadership at the University of Northern Iowa. He regularly provides consulting for schools and districts around the country in pursuit of ensuring student-centered assessment and grading practices. And he has also authored a book on this very practice. So welcome, Matt. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, Aaron. Thanks for having me.
Tell us a little bit about where you're joining us from today.
You betcha. I'm joining you from Cedar Falls, Iowa, a community of about 40,000 people here. Obviously, as you said, Lindsay, I work at the University of Northern Iowa, about 10,000 students, a comprehensive public university. A wonderful, wonderful place to ride your bike when the weather is nice. We're just approaching that season right now here in Iowa of the nice season. But if you ever get a chance to join us, bring your bike and join us here in Cedar Falls, Iowa.
I love it. I have actually endured a snowstorm in that very area. So I know that when you get nice weather, you're going to get out and appreciate it. Tell us a little bit beyond that. What's something else you might like us to know about you, your family, maybe your community?
Yeah. So my wife and I have 4 kids, kind of the elementary age on down. We enjoy spending our time being outside as much as we can in Iowa. Obviously, spend some time. We live in a kind of this university town area, and one of the things I think is unique here at the University of Northern Iowa is Kurt Warner is one of our famous alums, Super Bowl MVP a number of times, kind of made his second round of football awesomeness in the NFL, and so
Wow.
Kurt Warner is one of our claims to fame here at the University of Northern Iowa.
Super. I did not know that. Very cool. Thank you. And just following up on that, tell us maybe some more specifics about your current roles in education and your research interests.
Yeah, so I teach future principals, future school superintendents, all graduate students in educational leadership. We think through things like how to lead effective change, obviously about effective grading and assessment practices, what it means to be a leader of curriculum as a principal or as a district office administrator or as a superintendent. And some of the things that I research, a lot of the things that I research are the things that I thought about and experienced when I was a teacher or administrator. And so I tend to spend a lot of time talking with, surveying, interviewing, talking with, and being in schools to understand how schools are making some of these grading for learning shifts in their schools. And so one recent fun thing that we did is we did some interviews with some physical education teachers to find out kind of how this whole thing plays out, or maybe there's some successes and challenges in the world of physical education as they think about shifting towards grading for learning. So kind of a fun way to learn more about this from a teacher and then also their school administrator perspective as well.
Yeah, super. I bet it's great to interact with people that are in the field too and putting all that practice to work.
Makes it worthwhile, you bet, Lindsay.
Wonderful. Thank you.
All right. And I get to welcome our guest, Chris Thoms, who is a human-centered product designer here at NWEA. His work and leadership is all about making sure we understand and implement inclusive human-centered design practices, which definitely applies to making shifts in our grading practices. So welcome, Chris. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Where are you joining us from today?
I'm joining you from Tualatin, Kalapuya lands, otherwise known as Portland, Oregon. And that's where I'm at.
All right. How's it going up there in Portland? I'm about 300 miles south of you.
It's going well. Weather's nice. I feel like the rain has broken. We've had our 6-month rain break, so it's been 6 months of just clouds and drizzle, and we've gotten like 3 straight days of sunshine. So it's quite nice.
It's a good break.
Yeah.
What's one thing we should know about you or your family or your community?
Yeah, I'm a dad. I'm married. I have 2 kids, 2 boys, both pretty huge, pretty big kids. Yeah, that's like a full-time job feeding them. So it's kind of amazing. They're so big. It's actually kind of scary. So I guess that's one thing you should know about me. Chris's kids are big, and he's worried about how much food they're eating. There you go.
It's time to like take stock in some sort of food distribution.
Yeah, I feel like I'm keeping Costco in business. I don't know, like it's insane. I've never bought this much food in my life. It's wild.
It is pretty amazing.
I don't have 4 though, so that's Matt's got me beat there. That's a lot.
It's humbling. It's humbling for sure. What are your current roles in education, and what are your research interests?
My current role is I just became the sort of designer of the student experience inside of Map Growth Assessment. So I work with the item experience team, and we're looking at ways in which we can optimize student workflows inside of Map Growth Assessment, but also optimize workflows for the people who generate the items, item writers and such, to simplify their experience, to hopefully help enhance the student experience inside of Map Growth Assessment.
Mm-hmm. And what I love learning from you is how you're bringing that human-centered design to as many parts of the assessment process as possible. You know, I've talked about, like, we want to make sure we're not weaponizing any part of this. And there are habits and traditions that have happened, maybe continue to happen, where we can do harm, and we want to make sure we're not doing harm. We're doing these processes to support learning.
Absolutely. I think we've done what we do with the best of intentions. I think that when we make changes without talking to the people who are affected, we run the risk of really harming them unintentionally. Some of the worst things in education have come from unintentional sources. I literally created to do the exact opposite of what they did. And the way that we can help ourselves is to always be asking ourselves, who are we enabling with the changes that we're making, and who are we disabling? And then another thing that I would add to that is any changes you make for equity are innovation. Equity and innovation are the same thing. If your company or your school lacks innovation, it likely lacks equity. So begin to address those challenges, and you'll find new and innovative ways of helping your students learn.
I really like that connection. I love any synthesis, so it doesn't feel like we're piling on a plate. It's integrated. We can do this. It's not different things. It's all in the same vein. Thank you, Chris. Now we're going to dive into some questions.
Yeah, and what a great way to lead us into these questions too. So thank you. So Matt, we're going to start out with you, if you don't mind. And let's talk about, we know that in traditional grading systems, academic and behavior, or maybe what we would call a social emotional learning components, are often mixed together. So for listeners or viewers who are out there and maybe want to just begin this process of this grading for learning journey, what are some specific examples of how mixing together these learning components can be problematic, can even create or compound educational disparity or inequity?
Yeah, I love this question. It's really something that actually got me personally on my kind of grading for learning journey as a high school teacher back in the day. One of the things I really struggled with as a classroom teacher is my typical communication with students and parents was something like this: 14 out of 16 in the grade book, or maybe 85% in the grade book. And so if a student or parent saw 14 out of 16 in the grade book, it's like, for some students, that's great. And so awesome. For another student, it's like, what were those 2 points? What did I miss? And those 2 points could have been related to a small little error. It could have been a big conceptual, gap that they still have, but the grade book did not provide them with that detailed answer that maybe they were seeking out. Or maybe the communication was a percentage, right? Like an 85%. Well, what's the other 15%, right? And what was that 85% all made up of? Sue Brookhart, a number of years ago, called this hodgepodge grading, where there's just different factors that go all in together, and we really don't honestly know what that grade means. The best way I can think about to describe this is, sometimes I take my vehicle to the mechanic, and the mechanic will do like a 21-point car inspection. And so I know exactly how the brakes are and the tires and all these other different areas. And so it's good for me to know, specifically where my car needs some help and where my car is doing well. If we just were to say, oh, that your car is just 89% well, what if the brakes are the extra 11% that aren't doing well? Like, that's problematic for me as a car owner. And so when we think about combining academic and behavioral components together, we're just not telling a really good story. A phrase I heard once is that we really want to identify students that might have a skill gap. That's good to know. And also students that might have a will gap. But if we just defer to points and percentages, we're not probably going to be able to figure out who those specific students are that have the skill gap and what the specific skill is that we need to work towards. Or maybe it's more of a will gap. Maybe there's some sort of type of motivational issue or a mental health concern at home that we need to be addressing. The 14 out of 16 and the 85% just don't tell us that information. And so that's why schools I'm seeing are starting to say, how can we do this a little bit differently? Super.
I love that metaphor. And I mean, similarly, you think if you went to the doctor and they said that you're 72% well, you'd be alarmed, but you wouldn't know what to do with that information. That's great. Thank you.
Chris, what's your perspective?
For me, when I look at the way students, and I guess my focus for the past 2 years has been on African American and Latinx students. I would have to agree with what Matt said, that you can't really sum up what their achievement is with a single number or a percentage. That's not really truthful and honest. And it's one of these things that I'm looking at extreme situations in those communities. So situations in which maybe the only meals they get a day are at the school. We're talking about worst case scenarios. And so in dealing with that, 14 out of 16 doesn't, a student getting a 14 out of 16 that only gets 2 meals a day, that doesn't live in relative safety or comfort, that's an A+. That's amazing. That's so far above 14 out of 16. So it's not accounted for. Additionally, when you look at other measures of student achievement, such as SAT and ACT, an African-American student from a poor, disenfranchised area getting a 900 or a 1600 on the SAT, what does that really mean? What does that really equate to when you take into consideration all of the other factors? What's the translation? Because you have to imagine if those factors were removed, there might be a difference in student performance. So I think accounting for those things is really important. I think right now there is no way for a African American student of color to prove that they are learning, given the current structure of schools and testing. It is incredibly difficult, and they're always in this space. And this is I would say this might apply to any student that is not culturally sort of white and American. They're in a space of constantly translating themselves into a culture for their teachers, for their principals, for the people that they work with. Again, what does that add? Is there a degree of difficulty we can add to what they're doing to sort of validate that their lived experience is challenging? Or are we going to, I guess for me, I feel like those systems that we have right now don't really validate their learning. but they validate the learning of others. So there are those who are experiencing validation and those who are not. And I don't think that was ever the intention. But that is sort of what has come out of that. So what do we do about it? It's kind of that's where I live. So that's sort of, those are my thoughts.
Well, I think this is an excellent point to be bringing up with the two of you in that vein of the simple process of separating measures of achievement and behavior can begin to potentially pull out some of those pieces. If you, for instance, are accounting for behavior of a student, like you mentioned in the beginning, who hasn't had 2 meals today, and that's influencing their measures of achievement, their measures of learning, we've just basically administered an inequitable practice right there alone, right? We've reported back what we'd say is their measure of learning, when in fact that measure of learning may have been proficient, for instance, but it was distilled or it was influenced negatively, if you will, by something that was out of their control. So Matt, feel free to hop in and tag onto that if you'd like to, or we can do the next question.
I loved what Chris was saying. I could just really resonate and understand with that. As I think about my own kids, for example, they bring home these math worksheets every night, and by golly, if I wanted to, I could make sure that my kids get all of those math questions right, because I was a trained math teacher. My brother, we could call up Uncle Eric, and he could give them the answers, or Aunt Becky or Grandma or whoever, and we could make sure that my kids get all of their math worksheet answers right up until the day they're in calculus someday. But that's not the norm for families. And so if we're going to value, for example, if we're going to assign point value to what's happening at home, it will, as Chris mentioned, create a disparity. There's no doubt about it. And so, I think part of the solution is reporting those things separately, right? Reporting out some type of work habits that we see happening, and all that's separate from how well a student understands the math stuff, so that if and when there are concerns and disparities, we can be much more aware of them and be much more solution oriented. And separating these two things is not the magic silver bullet, but it does provide us with better information to make informed decisions that Chris was alluding to. And so I think this is just a real strong start to really acknowledging that some of our grading practices are very much inequitable.
Mm-hmm. And I like how we're connecting this, it's not the end all be all, but it can be a great step. And at the same time, I want to acknowledge that sometimes what gets in people's way about making the step of separating academics and behavior is the concern that, if I don't have the grade as the carrot or the stick, the reward or the consequence, the students won't be motivated. They won't be motivated to turn in their work on time. They won't be motivated to earn a good grade. So I think we could explore our working assumptions about, what actually motivates learners in learning, as well as, what else motivates learners in learning. So that's the two-part question I would like to explore. And Chris, we're gonna start with you. So thinking about what motivates learners in learning, what working assumptions might we need to explore, especially the assumption that grades or scores motivate, and what are possible other examples of ways we could motivate learners in learning?
I'm going to start with this. So I think there's an assumption being made that students are motivated by grades. And I think that's students that, I think a more accurate statement is students that have access to resources are motivated by grades because they can see the connection between getting good grades and having a successful life. But if you live in a circumstance in which your grades will not necessarily equal success in life, then you are not motivated by grades. And they actually don't matter. You're concerned about survival. So figuring out what your students value first is key. Because as soon as we start to say, student X is no longer motivated because we took grades out, well, there's an assumption there that the student is lazy. It may just be that the student has figured out that what he's doing in school or what she is doing in school will not get them to survival. And I think we need to be really clear about that. For certain types of learners, for certain groups of people and learning groups in this country, getting good grades has a bit of a prestige with it. You're sort of following in the family footsteps. There's all of this sort of extrinsic motivation that comes from your family and your culture and your society. And that's actually a really rare circumstance, much like Matt was describing with his family, about there being like 10 generations of mathematicians, essentially. And we can make sure you get it right. And we could probably make sure you get it right for a really long time, all the way to college. Yeah, that is a rare circumstance. But also a rare circumstance is having familial support, having functional households, having parents present, having parents that work 9-to-5 jobs and not 5 to 9 jobs, having childcare, having like generational family, like grandparents, great grandparents, extended family, aunts and uncles, all of that. There's the best case scenarios in education are made to match that circumstance, which is why we're seeing such a disparity going forward, because we've really designed education to match a best case scenario. We haven't designed it to meet a worst case scenario. And so hopefully I'm answering your question here, because
Yeah.
I'm kind of alluding to something that's a lot larger, but
yes,
but that's ultimately what initially I think educators are going to have to take account of themselves on an individual basis. Sadly, states rarely catch on before the educators on the ground do. Yeah. So likely if you take this on, you will be on your own to start. But I would just encourage you to be loud about what you're doing and about how it's working, so that it reaches the ears of those who are in power, that have the ability to adjust things structurally to make it work for diverse circumstances.
Yes.
So there's that. That would be my response.
Well, I also loved how you pointed out, ask what are students' values. What motivates? Let's not assume what motivates people, but let's ask.
Absolutely.
Matt, how would you like to connect?
Yeah. I just love what Chris was saying about kind of some of the bigger assumptions that are being made here about grading systems and supports. Taking it down just another level and down in the weeds for just a moment. As I think about kind of traditional grading practices, I think about this. Grades cannot realistically serve multiple masters. Here's what I mean by this. I had a science teacher. When I was a student in high school, I had a science teacher who, you got points for doing the homework, you got points for doing the lab reports, you got points for doing the tests, but you also got points taken away if you got kicked out of class too many times for poor behavior. And so there was like a motivational or a punishment factor related to this. And so if you got kicked out of class a couple times, you might take off a couple percentage points from your quarter grade. And so in that particular class, and my guess is there's not this exact example, but there are similarities to what I'm just describing with many classrooms, where there is a motivational or punishment effect or component to the grading system. And so when we say, again, that a kid has a 98%, what does that mean? When a kid has an 85%, what's that mean if the grade is trying to serve multiple masters? And so as we think about grading for learning, I propose that schools ought to be considering grades serving a single master, and that's communication. And so if the purpose of grades now is communication, what about the motivation factor? Like, what's that coming to play? So think about this, what I call the 6th grade test. Let's say that I'm a 9th grade teacher, and I'm just so frustrated because there's some students in my class that are just not turning stuff in. My typical response is I put a 0 in the grade book. But if we were to call up a teacher who had that same student in 6th grade, chances are they're also getting 0s in 6th grade and 7th grade and 8th grade, and now they are in 9th grade. So the 0 wasn't the solution to helping them out. And that's what Chris was talking about. Some students are just not going to respond to the 0 in the grade book being the motivational factor. And so we're working on this assumption that everyone is motivated by points, but the bottom line is, as Chris mentioned, is not everyone is motivated by points. Some students are and some students are not. So I propose that we ought to just take the motivational factor out of grades. So how can we then meaningfully motivate students to engage in learning exercises and meet due dates and things like that? Well, I think there's a lot of good examples out there. I mean, you hear about schools that are doing a lot more meaningful, authentic learning exercises. So it's not just doing it to accumulate points, but doing it because there is a bigger purpose, maybe a transferable skill. Maybe there's some community aspect to it. I'm solving a project that serves the community. Of course, there's a ton of schools out there that are just providing a lot more school choice. Hey, you know what? You have to demonstrate understanding of Pythagorean's theorem, but you can record a video, you can do a test. I mean, just multiple choices that students have to demonstrate their learning of something. And we know that students, adults, everyone tends to be motivated by having options in life. Mm-hmm. And of course, we've seen kind of the downsides of this too in the midst of the pandemic, right? Mm-hmm. Students who say, you know what, I'd rather be playing my Xbox than logging on to Zoom for class. They're making a choice, right? They're making a choice in their life. And so how can we repurpose? How can we kind of remanufacture those choices for students in the pandemic or otherwise so that they are choosing to learn rather than choosing to spend their time elsewhere?
Mm-hmm. And I like how that connects back to ask, what do you want to choose from to help you with your learning is a really great place to start. I'm going to kick it over to Lindsay for our next question.
And just to tag on to that, we had a great conversation in the previous episode. Some colleagues out there that you know are mentioning the idea of inviting students to learn too, and inviting them to be a part of that whole journey. And so we have to stop and think ourselves, is what we've created as a learning experience something they want to participate in? And Chris, you've rocked my world today in thinking about the systems that we have and who they are designed for, and knowing that they don't match everybody's purpose for motivation, if you will. So thank you for that. These are some wonderful ideas. Really appreciate it. We're going to move into another question and just keep this flowing here. So we have a lot of educators we know out there that might be wanting to start this process, making a change towards this journey. When they're thinking about starting or moving forward, they might face challenges partnering with families and communities. There might be some more familiarity out there with the traditional systems. We know that it's deeply rooted in tradition. So especially thinking about, these educational challenges of this particular last year, this year, if you will, what are some resources or strategies you might suggest where educators can help begin to open that conversation to partner with families and communities through the Grading for Learning shift? And Chris, I'd love to start with you if you have some ideas on that matter.
I think because of the remote nature of 2020, I think that teachers have had to get creative. I can tell you what I've done with my sons. I've wanted my son is really into art and design, which I can't say as a designer I'm disappointed with. I'm actually really happy about it. But one of the ways I've gotten him to be more interested and engaged with science is I've exposed him to some content from Netflix regarding design. There's you can look it up. There's a woman in Israel who is attempting, she says that she sees DNA as the keyboard or the piano that you can create with. So she's seeking to grow houses, like actually just grow them, as opposed to build them like we do. We cut down trees. So now, she's like, well, what if we could just grow a house? What if it could just be grown? Is that possible? And so she's looking at organic materials and materials that could be repurposed, that are hard compounds. She's come up with a compound that's stronger than steel, that's made out of like wheatgrass or something. It's ridiculous. But my son was enraptured in this piece of content because he doesn't like really care about molecules and atoms he didn't care about that. But after that, he was like, wait, there's a lot that's into this stuff. There's a lot that we can do. There's a lot in here. So I think it's really about being creative and finding things that are engaging, that connect the sort of science to application in real world situations. I think most of what kids learn in school it's applicable to your life. I think it's all applicable. But if you don't teach kids how it's applicable, they are not going to see a reason for doing that math sheet or any of it. They're not going to see a reason for doing absolutely any of it. So when you tell students, when I told students in Arkansas that sound levels and decibels are measures, they're scientific measures, and you actually need math to be able to make certain types of music, including hip hop, they got really serious about learning math. They because nobody had ever connected those two things for them, that, you know, a bar in rap is, you know, 16 measures, and they started to really break down the science of how you build and make music. And there's tons of math in music, like tons of it. And you can really connect things for kids in a way that makes sense to them, things that motivate them. Like I said, my son's not into science, he's into art, but I showed him how science can be art and how art can be science. And so now he's super engaged with that. And so that's maybe a lighthearted example of a way that you can do it. But think about content that engages you. I guess, and this might be controversial, so, you know, you guys are professional educators, you can check me on this, but my son will be an adult one day. And so I teach him things like he's an adult at times, because he needs to understand that when you're a designer, or when you're an artist, or when you're a soccer player, you have responsibilities that align with your educational goals, and you need to make sure those things connect, right? For anybody who want to be professional athletes, they need to understand finance. That's a big deal. They need to understand accounting and finance and investment and all of those things that you need, numbers, percentages, all these things to understand, stock derivatives and all the things, right? So why are we not using those real world applications as motivations to do better in the classroom for all students? I think this is done in some places, but you don't really see it in areas that would be considered low SES as often. So can we connect those things and motivate people? That's kind of how that's my suggestion / practice.
I love it. Matt, you want to tag on to that?
Yeah, you bet. I love the real world connections that Chris is making here. And I think another real world connection we can make with parents and families is some of the like the extracurricular type of things. You know, hey, my kid goes to the rec center, or my kid goes to the local park, and there's someone there that's just helping them become better at sports, or helping them become better as an artist, or helping them become better as a musician. And what type of feedback do those mentors give our kids? And it's usually very specific feedback. It's not, again, back to what I said earlier, like a 98% or an 85% or a 65%. It's very specific feedback. I know the best volleyball coaches, for example, that say, hey, players, you're really good at hitting, a spike, but you need to get better at a dig, for example. And so why wouldn't we want to also give that same type of feedback to the learners in our classroom? And so in order to help our parents and other community members that are just unfamiliar with this shift because they're so used to traditional grading systems, one practice that I've seen, we actually modeled this at one point in time in our school, is we provided a sample grade book that's very what anyone in a typical school would see, right? Worksheet, 3 out of 4, quiz, test, just as traditional as all gets out. No name on it, just hand it out to a group of people or flash it up on a screen on Zoom in the pandemic era here, and say, hey, what does this kid need to do to get better, and what are they already doing well? And the responses are, well, they need to get better at tests or quizzes or turn in a few more assignments or something along those lines, right? Like, that's what you're going to get from seeing a traditional grade book. Now, take away that traditional grade book or take that off the screen. Hand out a grade book that reports out learning based upon some specific learning goals, like area of a circle, area of a triangle, Pythagorean theorem, citing textual evidence for an English standard, for example, and use some type of scale that shows how well the student has learned each one of those things. And then ask, again, this is just a fictitious grade book or report card, what does this student need to know to get better? Well, it's going to be pretty apparent because they're going to see the specific learning goals that student needs to get better at or is already doing well at. and then say, hey, community, hey, school, hey, parents, hey, students, we're going to be making a shift in our school because we believe that we want to provide the same level of feedback to you as learners as our volleyball coach would do if you're on the volleyball team. And so that's why we're making this grading for learning shift, because we believe the purpose of grades should be to communicate students' current levels of learning. And so I think this really simple exercise that really anyone could do, and we could translate into different languages for all the different folks out there in different communities. I think we could really transfer this practice in our schools to begin the conversation about moving from what I call a school or a culture of earning to really more of a school or a culture of learning.
I really like that. That's the best explanation so far of what we mean by grading for learning. We use other terminology, standards-based grading or proficiency grading, and let's zoom in on the aim, the purpose, learning. So thank you for that excellent explanation. We are already, having such a rich discussion. We're running out of time, so I'd like to have the opportunity to ask for any last thoughts about this topic, how to make sure we're really looking at our traditional practices and perhaps starting or continuing with how to make sure and attend to both academics and behaviors, but attend to them in ways that are equitable and exploring ways that truly motivate students instead of using grades as any kind of characteristic. So last thoughts, Chris, we're going to hand it over to you. Last thoughts for today.
I think I always employ human-centered design when I work. So I think the practice of empathizing with your students, particularly those who are struggling the most, is massively effective. When you sort of address the worst case scenarios, you tend to help everyone out, even those who are achieving. So by making an adjustment that serves the sort of most marginalized group in your class, maybe you're sort of letter grade D, E, F, G, whatever, by serving those students, you actually serve everyone better. If you have a hard time believing that, there's a company, they're called Apple. Every single product improvement they've ever made has been about equity and inclusion. There's a reason why Siri it responds to Hey Siri, because they are acknowledging that some people don't have hands. There's a reason why now there's facial recognition when you look at your phone, because again, that's another acknowledgement that people don't have hands. There's a reason why there is a force touch that gives you options, because some people only have one hand. All of their innovation is equity. All of it. There's not a single product improvement that they've made that has not been equity focused. And they're the biggest company in the world, I think, at this point. Well, Amazon's bigger than them now. But it's just something that you should think about, the way that your phone, your iPhone, or if you have an iPhone, all of the ways in which it works so wonderfully now. There's so many things that you don't have to think about. That all came from helping the most marginalized users of their devices, all of it. And they would say that they are still very, very far away from having a device that they feel like they could call inclusive. So just think about that. There's billions and trillions of dollars that say that works. So I think it might work in your classroom. That's kind of, those are my thoughts.
I like those connections and exploring our assumptions, exploring perhaps below, what our habits have set us up to explore, going a couple steps deeper into what ultimately is going to benefit everybody, all of our learners.
Yeah. The key step being as soon as you identify who's the most marginalized, you have a conversation with them about what is not working.
Yeah. And
what
why?
Can I do to help you?
Yeah.
That's always come at it with an approach of what can I do to help you?
Yeah.
You'll be surprised what your students tell you. I was blown away by the answers I got from the most marginalized students in America. It shocked me, the level and clarity of advice that they had for me about how what we were doing was impacting them. So there's
love that. Start by asking, Matt, what are your last thoughts?
Yeah, I love what Chris is saying. I kind of hear what Chris is saying is don't let perfect get in the way of progress. And we want to keep incrementally moving towards making a better, grading for learning system. And I really just, I'm all on board with you, Chris, in that mindset. As I think about that, just maybe one last kind of parting thought is that sometimes when we think about separating measures of academic from behavior, sometimes the schools I've been involved with, sometimes they get so caught up in like the specifics of it, like what should be our scale? Should we use a 1, 2, 3, 4 scale, or a exceeds or not exceeds or whatever? Like, they just get so caught up in the details. And I think it definitely is a time to talk about those details, but leading with the details takes us away from the purpose of doing all this. And so, as those that are watching and listening to this podcast episode, perhaps a first step again is to really focus on what's the purpose of grades. And if we focus on what the purpose of grades are in our classrooms and our schools, that will lead us into so many of the conversations that we have talked about today, and we won't get lost in the weeds, but instead stay focused on the main thing and keep the main thing the main thing. And I think that's just a great way to lead, is by keeping the main thing the main thing. So, just like if you're listening right now, like just say it from your living room or from your office. The purpose of grades ought to be communicating student learning. Like.
Yes.
I heard a few people around the country say it.
Definitely.
All right.
Definitely.
Awesome.
I love it. I love it. Thank you both so much. This has been such a rich discussion. And we just want to highlight too that, there's plenty of resources out there. First and foremost, Matt himself has authored a book around this practice if you're an educator and you'd be interested in that. And certainly he also has a website that he catalogs and organizes a lot of resources purely out there meant to support educators interested in pursuing this journey. Chris, it's been incredible. Thank you so much. And Aaron, I know I'd say it from my part, I've learned a great deal from you both just in this workshop today, or this session today. Aaron, any last words? And we'll be ending and setting up everybody to view the next episode coming forward. So
just many, many thanks. I know everyone is busy, plates are full, so I appreciate everyone's time, your thought, your willingness to join us for this conversation.
Really appreciate it. The next episode is going to feature Ken O'Connor and Dr. Fashawn Davis as we dig into understanding the value of offering students multiple opportunities to show what they know. So stay tuned, and thank you all again. Have a great day.
Thank you.